welcome to the BP Mindcast. I'm Jonathan Bartlett, your host. These podcasts cover a wide variety of topics from a conservative academic viewpoint. Some you'll find interesting, some you won't. However, I plan on keeping these short enough that you can easily enjoy what you like, and hopefully I won't keep you too long for those that you don't. Today we're going to be talking about the wealth gap, or the gap between the rich and the poor, which is oftentimes talked about. And what I want to say is that the gap between the rich and the poor is a total non-issue. In fact, the people who are bringing it up actually don't care about the poor, or if they do, they're approaching it in vastly the wrong way. So I have to say, first of all, I have a lot of care for the poor. I think that it's an important topic. I think that we should be doing all that we can to find people who don't have what they need and make sure that they get what they need. But the problem is that when you frame it in terms of a wealth gap, or a gap between the rich and the poor, you're actually addressing entirely the wrong problem. In fact, you're actually addressing the solution to the problem as if it were the problem. People assume that people make two assumptions when they talk about the gap between the rich and the poor. First of all, they make the assumption that the gap is there because the rich are taking advantage of the poor. And the second thing that they assume is that the gap exists because that if the gap exists, then that means the things the rich people have, they have because the poor people don't. And both of those things are actually false. So to understand this, let me give you a quick hypothetical. So let's say that you have a country that whose population makes between the on the low side, you have people making $10,000 a year, and on the high side, you have people making $40,000 a year. Well, that is a very small gap between the rich and the poor. So let me talk about another hypothetical cut. So, well, actually, on that one, let's imagine on that country, where's the distribution? Let's just say it's a fairly even distribution, where so you'd have several people around the 10,000 mark, several people around the 20,000 mark, several people around the 30,000 mark, and several people around the 40,000 mark. So you've got a pretty even distribution. Okay. Now let us propose another country, and this other country has a gap between the rich and the poor. So you have the poorest make $10,000 a year, and the richest make $1 million a year. Okay, so there you have a very large gap between the rich and the poor. But how does that play out? Well, you have the poorest people are still at $10,000 a year, but you have the wealth actually spread out where more people are not on poverty wages. And so while it doesn't necessarily help the people who make $10,000 a year, that the wealth is spread out. There are a lot of people being helped. And that's the thing, is that, the question is, do you prefer everyone or a lot of people being helped more than you prefer no one being helped? Because in the situation where there's not a large gap between the rich and the poor, in the first country we thought about, there wasn't a large gap, but everybody was basically poor. In the second one, there was a large gap, and but the large gap is actually because there were people who were out of poverty. And so now those aren't the only two possibilities. There's a lot of other ways that wealth could be distributed, but my point is that the gap itself doesn't matter. In fact, the gap itself might be indicative of the fact that people are actually escaping poverty. And so if you talk about the gap between the rich and the poor, it's kind of a non-issue. You're talking about the wrong thing. You're actually talking about being envious of the rich. And envy actually is one of the 7 deadly sins. These are things that you're not supposed to do. You're not supposed to be envious. It leads to societal problems. You can't be moralizing about poverty and invoking sin as the reason for moralizing about poverty. It's a non sequitur. So anyway, so the gap is not the issue. In fact, the gap is what can help fix the issue, because first of all, having a gap means that there's people who aren't poor. Second of all, if there's a gap, that means that there's people who can help the poor. Now, simply taking things from the poor and taking things from the rich and giving it to the poor actually doesn't help the poor as much as you might think. Because it does two things. First of all, it demotivates the rich. And a lot of the people who are rich, not everyone who's rich got there via hard work, but a lot of people did. Uh, Wealth comes from people who create things. A great book on this is 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. And basically, the people get wealthy by creating brand new things, giving us new ideas that we never thought of before. Steve Jobs didn't invent Apple by stealing iPhones from the poor. He invented iPhones, things that we didn't have before, and that we're all richer because they exist. And so, actually, the people who are very wealthy are actually oftentimes, just by their existence, um, are making the people at the bottom of the scale actually wealthier in real terms. If we were to actually have uh, tried to accomplish that by taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor, well, what we would have done is we would have prevented a lot of innovations that required capital um, to move forward. If you don't have the people who are good at investing capital doing that, um, then um, then you wind up without all these inventions and great things uh, that make the poor's life much better. The gap between the rich and the poor also helps innovation in another way, in that when products first come onto market, they are expensive, and then their price drops, and so eventually the price drops enough so that the poor can afford them. Well, the poor could never have them at all if the rich couldn't afford them at the beginning. So there has to be a group of people who actually can afford the new products in order for them to exist at all. So you actually have this gap between the rich and the poor winds up helping lots of people, and it's not harming. The gap itself is not harming anyone. Now, the fact that there are people who are not making enough to feed their families, to live in their house, that is a problem. And any problem that you want to propose that somebody is actually having with their life, I think that's worth addressing. But the gap is, if somebody else owns 5 yachts, I don't own even a small rowboat. But if somebody else owns 5 yachts, that is actually not materially harming me. So this idea that the gap is a problem is false. It's the gap is not the problem. Now, there might also be people who are rich um, by illegitimate means. That is also a problem. But again, it's the illegitimate means that are a problem, not the gap. The gap actually has nothing to do with whether or not the poor are being taken care of, or that the rich got there legitimately. Um, so finally, the other thing is that when you try to increase the size of the government to do these things, to redistribute wealth and whatnot, you wind up, instead of the people um, who are actively benefiting society being the ones that spring to the top, you have the government deciding via favor who benefits and who doesn't. That is crony capitalism. That is actually the opposite of what generates wealth for society. Society's wealth comes from people taking risks, building things, making new things, and making products that we never would have had before. But when you have the government trying to direct that, the government has no expertise in this whatsoever. And so they actually just what they do is they wind up redistributing what we already had, and this pipeline of new things goes away. And so, as I said, the government has no, we don't elect people who build things. The people we elect have no idea what even goes into that. And so expecting them to do it right is a bad expectation. So, in all, if you hear people talk about the gap between the rich and the poor, please correct them. Please don't let people continue to talk about that because it distracts from real issues that the poor are having. It distracts from the real issues of people who are gaining wealth illegitimately. Those are both real issues, but the gap is a non-issue, and in fact, it takes our focus away from the real issues and focuses it somewhere where it shouldn't be. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed our time on BP Mindcast. Until then, keep thinking.